The weight of a newborn pressing against your chest at 3 in the morning carries the entire universe with it. Every parent knows this moment, when the initial rush of love collides with something else entirely. Something darker, a whisper that cuts through the exhaustion and wonder, what have I done? Here in this fluorescent-lit hospital room, holding 7 pounds of pure possibility, you realize you've made the most consequential decision any human can make. You've forced another consciousness into existence. Without their permission, without any guarantee of their happiness, with only the absolute certainty that they will suffer, struggle, and die. Did I have the right? This is the parental paradox, and it haunts every civilization that has ever drawn breath. We tell ourselves we create children out of love, hope, and biological purpose. But scratch beneath that beautiful narrative, and something more troubling emerges. Something we're not supposed to talk about at dinner parties or baby showers. Consider this. Global birth rates are collapsing. Over 20 developed nations now have fertility rates below replacement level. The most educated, thoughtful members of our species are choosing not to reproduce at unprecedented rates. Why? What do they see that previous generations missed? Perhaps they see the equation too clearly. On one side, the optimists promise that children are the ultimate expression of hope, love, and human meaning. On the other, the pessimists' uncomfortable truth that to create a child is to guarantee their suffering without their consent. No one asks to be born. Every human who has ever existed was forced into this strange, beautiful, terrible experience by the choices of others. We are all conscripts in the army of existence, drafted by people who believed they knew what was best for us. But here's what makes this paradox so captivating, so urgent. We are the first generation in human history with enough knowledge, agency, and existential awareness to truly choose. We are no longer slaves to pure biological imperative or religious command. We can step outside the machinery of reproduction and ask the question that terrifies and liberates in equal measure. Should we? To understand this paradox, to really see it clearly, we must journey through philosophy, psychology, and the very architecture of human consciousness itself. We must excavate the ancient arguments, dissect the psychological machinery, and confront the modern crisis that has brought this eternal question to a breaking point. Because somewhere between the hospital room and the grave, between the first breath and the last, lies the answer to who we really are and what we owe to those we might create. The question is older than Christianity, older than philosophy, older perhaps than civilization itself. But to trace its roots, we must begin where all great human anxieties begin, in the collision between divine command and human doubt. Be fruitful and multiply. 4 words from Genesis that have driven human behavior for millennia. Across the Abrahamic traditions, procreation isn't just encouraged, it's commanded. A divine imperative written into the very fabric of religious consciousness. To have children is to fulfill God's plan, to participate in the ongoing act of creation. But even in humanity's earliest texts, doubt creeps in. The Buddhists and Hindus understood something profound about existence. Life is samsara, an endless cycle of birth, suffering, death, and rebirth. Enlightenment isn't about living better, it's about escaping the cycle entirely. The wheel of existence isn't a gift, it's a prison. This tension between creation as blessing and existence as burden found its voice in ancient Greece. 2,500 years ago, Sophocles wrote words that still chill. Not to be born is best. With gravitas, his contemporary Theogenes of Megara was even more direct. The best of all things is never to have been born. These weren't throwaway lines from pessimistic poets. Shake of the head. They were profound philosophical positions, early seeds of what we now call anti-natalism, the view that existence itself might be a net negative. But it was Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in 19th century Germany, who gave this ancient intuition its modern form. Schopenhauer looked at human existence and saw something that polite society preferred to ignore. We are driven by what he called the will to live, a blind, insatiable force that guarantees suffering. We're like lambs in a field, disporting themselves under the eye of the butcher, who chooses out first one and then another for his prey. Life, in his view, oscillates between the poles of want and boredom. We suffer because we lack what we desire. We suffer because we're bored when we get it. Satisfaction is always temporary. Dissatisfaction is the human condition. For Schopenhauer, to bring a child into the world was to condemn them to this endless striving. It was, quite literally, an act of cruelty disguised as love. The will to live tricks us into reproduction, using our deepest emotions, love, hope, biological drive, to perpetuate itself through new generations of sufferers. This wasn't just philosophical speculation for Schopenhauer. This was lived reality. He chose never to have children himself, believing it would be immoral to pass on the burden of existence. Schopenhauer's influence rippled through intellectual history. Nietzsche grappled with his pessimism before ultimately rejecting it. Freud built on his insights about unconscious drives. Slight lift in tone, reflective. And in our own era, philosophers like David Benatar have refined his arguments into sophisticated ethical frameworks. But Schopenhauer's pessimism emerged from a particular historical moment, the collapse of Enlightenment optimism. For centuries, European thinkers had believed in progress, reason, and the perfectibility of humanity. Children weren't just biological necessities, they were investments in a better future. Each generation would be wiser, happier, more rational than the last. The Romantics doubled down on this optimism, celebrating procreation as the ultimate creative act. To have a child was to participate in the grand project of human improvement. Love could conquer suffering. Knowledge could defeat ignorance. The future would justify the present. By the 20th century, after 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and the dawn of nuclear weapons, that optimism looked naive. Philosophy had fractured into 2 irreconcilable camps: those who still believed existence was inherently meaningful and worth propagating, and those who suspected consciousness itself might be a cosmic accident, a beautiful, terrible mistake that creates more suffering than it alleviates. The question was no longer whether we could have children, but whether we should. And that question became urgent, not just for philosophers, but for every person facing the possibility of parenthood. The ancient argument had evolved into a modern crisis, and that crisis demanded new tools, new insights, and a deeper understanding of why humans create life in the first place. Strip away the poetry, the religious language, the romantic ideals, and what remains? Why do humans really have children? The answer lies buried in the machinery of our minds, in evolutionary imperatives, psychological needs, and cognitive biases we barely understand. Start with biology. Richard Dawkins revolutionized our understanding of reproduction with a simple, brutal insight. We are not the masters of our genes. We are their survival machines, built for one purpose: replication. The desires, emotions, and meanings we attach to having children, from this perspective, they're just evolutionary software designed to make us want to pass on our genetic code. The biological drive to reproduce isn't about our happiness. It's about genetic continuation. It doesn't matter if parenthood makes us miserable, as long as it makes us reproduce. Evolution doesn't optimize for human flourishing, it optimizes for genetic success. But we are not just biological machines. We are conscious beings, cursed with the knowledge of our own mortality. And this knowledge, according to terror management theory, shapes everything we do.
Ernest Becker, in his masterwork, The Denial of Death, argued that humans are unique among animals in knowing they will die. This knowledge creates a fundamental terror that drives most human behavior. We can't accept that our lives are temporary, insignificant, and will be forgotten. So we create what Becker called immortality projects: art, religion, monuments, ideologies, anything that allows us to transcend death symbolically. Children are the ultimate immortality project. Through them, we achieve literal genetic continuation and symbolic immortality. They carry our DNA, our names, our values into the future. In a universe that guarantees our individual extinction, children offer the illusion of permanence. Research supports this theory. Studies show that when people are primed with death anxiety, reminded of their mortality, they express stronger desires to have children. The terror of death makes procreation more appealing, not less. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, identified another psychological drive: the human need for meaning. In the concentration camps, Frankl observed that those who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or smartest, but those who found purpose in their suffering. Parenthood offers ready-made meaning in an otherwise ambiguous universe. When life feels pointless, children provide instant purpose. When existence feels absurd, raising a child feels profoundly significant. The problem: if we have children primarily to find meaning for ourselves, are we using them as tools for our existential needs? But even if we acknowledge these deeper drives, our conscious minds tell us we're making rational decisions. We believe we want children because they'll make us happy, because we'll be good parents, because the world needs more love. But the psychological research tells a different story. We are victims of systematic cognitive biases that distort our thinking about parenthood. The optimism bias makes us overestimate the likelihood of positive outcomes and underestimate suffering. We assume our children will be happy, healthy, and successful. We minimize the chances of depression, illness, or tragedy. The impact bias leads us to overestimate how much happiness children will bring and how long that happiness will last. The reality? Multiple studies show that parental happiness often decreases after childbirth, especially for women. The anticipated joy is real, but it's briefer and more complicated than we predict. Then there's what we might call the genetic trap. The belief that our child will be different, they'll have better opportunities than we did, we'll be better parents than our parents were, we'll break the cycles of dysfunction and trauma. This narrative is seductive and often false.
Modern science reveals an uncomfortable truth. Trauma can be inherited. Epigenetics shows us that the effects of stress, depression, and trauma can be passed down through genetic modifications. Children of depressed parents are significantly more likely to experience depression themselves. We may be passing down not just genes, but inherited patterns of suffering. Even happiness itself is subject to the hedonic treadmill. Our tendency to adapt to both positive and negative circumstances and return to a baseline level of well-being. The joys of parenthood fade. The challenges become normalized. If the gift of life ultimately results in a return to baseline happiness, punctuated by inevitable suffering and ending in death, what exactly are we giving? The machinery is complex and largely unconscious. We have children because evolution programmed us to want them. We have children because we're terrified of death and need symbolic immortality. We have children because we're desperate for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. We have children because psychological biases make us overconfident about positive outcomes and underestimate risks. These forces are powerful, ancient, and compelling. But are they good reasons? Or are they simply compelling reasons? Evolutionary and psychological pressures that feel like choices but are actually forms of sophisticated manipulation. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is this: the machinery that drives us to have children has nothing to do with what's best for the children themselves. It's about what's best for our genes, our terror management, and our meaning-making needs. If that's true, then the parental paradox becomes even more acute. We create children to serve our own psychological needs, then convince ourselves we're giving them a gift. We satisfy our evolutionary programming, then rationalize it as love. The machinery reveals itself when we look closely enough. The question is whether we have the courage to see it clearly and the wisdom to decide what to do with that knowledge. Something has shifted in the collective human psyche. For the first time in recorded history, the most educated, prosperous, and thoughtful members of our species are choosing not to reproduce. Birth rates across the developed world aren't just declining, they're collapsing. South Korea's fertility rate has plummeted to 0.72 children per woman, the lowest in the world. Japan, Italy, and Spain all hover around 1.3. The replacement rate, the number needed to maintain population stability, is 2.1. Most developed nations are nowhere close. This isn't just about economics, though economic factors play a role. Something deeper is happening. A new generation is looking at the ancient equation, life's joys balanced against life's sufferings, and reaching different conclusions than their ancestors.
Climate anxiety has given birth to an entirely new phenomenon, the birth strike movement. These aren't fringe activists or misanthropes. They're educated professionals, often in their 20s and 30s, who have made a calculated decision. As one member put it, I cannot, in good conscience, bring a child into a world that may be uninhabitable in their lifetime. The ethics are stark. We know that climate change will reshape civilization. We can predict rising sea levels, extreme weather, resource conflicts, and mass migrations. Is it moral to create a person who will inherit the consequences of environmental destruction we caused? Is it fair to force someone to live through what may be humanity's greatest crisis? The economic pressures are equally daunting. In the United States, the USDA estimates it costs over $310,000 to raise a child from birth to age 18. Factor in college costs, and the number approaches $500,000.
Meanwhile, millennials and Generation Z face financial realities their parents never imagined. Crushing student debt, stagnant wages despite increased productivity, housing costs that consume half their income. "I can barely take care of myself" becomes the refrain. How can I justify bringing someone else into this struggle? Into this environment has emerged anti-natalism as a legitimate philosophical position. David Benatar's 2006 book, Better Never to Have Been, provided intellectual firepower for what many had felt intuitively. Benatar's argument is elegantly simple and disturbingly compelling. The absence of pain is good, even if there's no one around to enjoy that absence. The absence of pleasure, however, is not bad unless there's someone being deprived of it. This asymmetry means that non-existence is always preferable to existence. We can't be harmed by pleasures we never experience if we never exist. But we can certainly be harmed by pains we do experience if we're brought into being. Online communities like the r/antinatalism subreddit have grown to hundreds of thousands of members, sharing stories, philosophical arguments, and mutual support for their choice not to reproduce. These aren't people consumed by nihilism or depression. Many report being quite content with their lives. They simply believe that existence, on balance, contains more suffering than joy, and that it's unethical to impose that equation on another consciousness. The response has been swift and often hysterical. Elon Musk regularly tweets about underpopulation as civilization's greatest threat. Politicians in Hungary and Poland offer increasingly generous financial incentives for childbirth. Corporate leaders warn about labor shortages and declining consumption. This reveals something crucial about the modern debate. Pronatalism isn't just about individual happiness or human flourishing. It's about maintaining economic and political systems that require constant growth, increasing consumption, and expanding populations. The question becomes, are we having children for their benefit or to feed economic machines that require ever more workers and consumers?
Social media has amplified the paradox in unexpected ways. Instagram and TikTok present curated visions of perfect parenting, beautiful children, happy families, meaningful moments captured and filtered. The reality, hidden behind the highlight reels, is more complex. Parental burnout, mental health crises, exhaustion from the demands of gentle parenting, and constant optimization. Simultaneously, child-free influencers showcase alternative life paths: travel, career advancement, financial freedom, personal growth unencumbered by dependence. The contrast is stark and intentional. The ideological divide has become increasingly clear. Progressive, educated urban populations trend toward childlessness or delayed childbearing. They cite climate concerns, economic inequality, and social justice as reasons to avoid reproduction. Conservative, religious, and rural populations maintain higher birth rates, often viewing procreation as moral and patriotic duty. But beneath these political divisions lies a deeper philosophical tension: individual freedom versus societal continuation, personal liberation versus collective responsibility, the right to choose childlessness versus the need for demographic sustainability. Can a civilization survive if its most thoughtful, educated members choose not to reproduce? Will the future belong to those who breed without questioning, while those who question choose not to breed? The implications are staggering and largely unexplored. The battlefield is drawn not just between competing philosophies, but between competing visions of human purpose. On one side, the biological, psychological, and cultural forces that have driven procreation for millennia. On the other, a generation equipped with unprecedented information, agency, and existential awareness.
They see the machinery of reproduction more clearly than any generation before them. They understand the psychological biases, the evolutionary programming, the social pressures. And increasingly, they're choosing to step outside that machinery entirely. The parental paradox is no longer an abstract philosophical question. It's the lived reality facing millions of people, making the most consequential choice of their lives. And their answers will shape not just their own futures, but the future of consciousness itself on this planet. We've traveled from ancient Greece to modern Reddit forums, from Schopenhauer's pessimism to contemporary climate anxiety, from evolutionary biology to terror management theory. We've excavated the machinery of reproduction and witnessed its contemporary crisis. And what have we discovered?
We have children because we are biological creatures, programmed by evolution to replicate our genes. We have children because we are psychological beings, terrified of death and desperate for meaning. We have children because we are social creatures, embedded in cultures that valorize parenthood and stigmatize childlessness. But we are also conscious beings, capable of stepping outside these forces and asking, should we? That question, that capacity for ethical reflection about our most basic drives, may be the most distinctly human characteristic we possess. It's what separates us from every other species on Earth. And it's what makes the parental paradox so profound and so urgent. There is no correct answer because the question operates at the intersection of biology and ethics, instinct and reason, individual desire and collective responsibility. Every child born will experience both joy and suffering. This is not a bug in the system. It's the fundamental nature of conscious existence. The question is not whether suffering exists, but whether existence despite suffering has inherent value. And that question cannot be answered abstractly. It can only be answered by each conscious being for themselves in their specific circumstances with their particular values and limitations. Albert Camus wrote that the only serious philosophical question is suicide, whether life is worth living despite its absurdity and suffering. The parental paradox extends this question. Is life worth imposing on another? We cannot answer this for others. We can only answer it for ourselves with full awareness of what we're doing and complete acceptance of moral responsibility. If you choose to have a child, you must accept that you are creating a consciousness that will experience pain, loss, heartbreak, failure, and death. You are also potentially creating a consciousness that will know beauty, love, wonder, discovery, and meaning. You cannot predict which will dominate. You cannot guarantee a net positive outcome. You can only act with humility and fierce responsibility. This reframes the entire question. Perhaps the issue is not, should we create life? But if we do, how must we live? If you bring a child into existence, you become obligated to minimize suffering where possible, to equip them with tools of resilience and meaning-making, and to acknowledge the weight of the choice you made for them. Parenthood is not a default life path, not a right, not a self-completion project. It is a sacred responsibility taken on behalf of another consciousness. It demands the highest ethical standards we can muster. But even this reframing doesn't resolve the paradox. It simply makes us more conscious of its implications.
Perhaps that consciousness is enough. Perhaps the parental paradox serves its purpose not by providing answers, but by forcing us to think more deeply about existence, responsibility, and what we owe to future generations. In Camus' retelling of the myth of Sisyphus, the king condemned to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, he writes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." The happiness comes not from escape or resolution, but from conscious engagement with the task itself. One must also imagine the potential child, existing in that space before existence, in the realm of pure possibility, at peace with whatever choice we make on their behalf. Because that choice, whatever it is, will be made by conscious beings grappling with unconscious forces, trying to do right in a universe that offers no guarantees. The parental paradox persists because it must. It's not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be embraced. The tension between our biological nature and our ethical capacity, between individual freedom and collective continuation, between the terror of meaninglessness and the responsibility of choice. And so we're left with the question that started this journey, refined now by everything we've learned. If you were the one who could choose whether or not to be born, knowing nothing of what your life would hold, only that it would contain both suffering and joy in unknowable measure, what would you choose? And if you cannot answer that question with certainty, what right do you have to answer it for another? The parental paradox offers no escape from this responsibility. It only makes us more conscious of the choice we're making, and the consciousness we might create to face these same impossible questions in their turn.